Luke Calloway was a self-made man, a visionary who built an empire on honesty. But when greed, betrayal, and corruption took everything, he had two choices: walk away or fight back. What he did next shocked an entire industry. This is a story of power, deception, and redemption. And trust me, you won't want to miss a second. Will Luke rise again or lose everything forever? Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay until the end to find out. The truth changes everything. Let's begin. The Houston skyline gleamed under the late afternoon sun, casting long shadows over the city's sprawling urban landscape. From the glass-paneled windows of his penthouse office, Luke Calloway gazed down at the streets below, watching the slow crawl of traffic and the hurried pace of pedestrians weaving through the downtown chaos. It was a sight he had admired for years, a city of ambition, of endless possibilities. It was also a city where he had built his empire. Luke had founded Falcon Auto Group nearly 2 decades ago, with nothing but a dream and a drive to succeed. He had started as a lowly salesman at a struggling dealership, watching firsthand how customers were manipulated, overcharged, and lied to. The experience had ignited something in him, a vision to build a dealership that did things differently, one that valued integrity and treated customers with respect. Over the years, he had worked tirelessly to make that dream a reality, growing Falcon Auto from a single, modest lot into one of the most trusted car dealership chains in the state. At least, that's what he had believed. Recently, troubling rumors and complaints had started surfacing about one of his flagship locations, Falcon Auto Houston. Customers were coming forward with disturbing allegations: hidden fees, predatory lending, deceptive sales tactics. The stories painted a picture of a dealership that was unrecognizable from the business he had spent years building. At first, Luke had dismissed the complaints as isolated incidents, a few bad experiences blown out of proportion. But the complaints didn't stop. In fact, they grew in frequency and severity. He received emails from frustrated customers, voicemails filled with anger and disappointment. Online reviews for Falcon Auto Houston had plummeted, riddled with warnings to stay away and beware of scams. Even worse, some of the negative reviews came from former employees, salesmen who had left, claiming they could no longer stomach the unethical practices they had been forced to follow. Luke had confronted his board of directors, demanding answers. He had expected concern, urgency, a plan to fix the issue. Instead, he had been met with shrugs and empty reassurances. The dealership is more profitable than ever, his CFO, Richard Webb, had told him during their last meeting. Sales are up, revenue is steady. There's no real problem here, Luke. Luke had clenched his jaw, frustration simmering beneath the surface. If customers are being ripped off, we have a serious problem. Webb had sighed as if Luke was being unreasonable. This is how the industry works. We can't afford to play the hero, Luke. People get over bad deals. They always do. That had been the last straw. Luke knew there was only one way to get the truth. Dressed in a pair of worn jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and an old leather jacket, Luke didn't look anything like a CEO as he pulled into the lot of Falcon Auto Houston. His car, a beat-up 1999 Chevy Silverado, fit the part of a man who wasn't looking for luxury, just reliability. The dealership was sleek and modern, with its towering glass facade and rows of freshly polished vehicles gleaming in the Texas sun. Inside, through the showroom windows, Luke could see salesmen in sharp suits, standing in practiced positions, waiting like sharks for their next customer. He took a deep breath, then stepped out of his truck and onto the lot, blending seamlessly into the steady stream of customers browsing the rows of vehicles. It took less than 2 minutes for a salesman to approach. "Afternoon, sir." A well-dressed man in his mid-30s flashed an overconfident smile. "Looking for a new ride today?" Luke returned the smile, playing his part. "Yeah, I need something reliable. A used sedan, nothing too fancy." The salesman's grin widened. "An easy target. Well, you're in luck. We've got some of the best used inventory in the city. Let me show you around." As the salesman led him through the lot, rattling off carefully rehearsed lines about unbeatable deals and limited time offers, Luke let his attention drift. He was watching, listening. Years in the business had trained him to pick up on the subtleties. The nervous glances between employees, the hurried whispers behind the customer service counter. Something was off. And then, he heard it. "Please, isn't there anything you can do?" The voice was tired, trembling. Luke turned his head slightly, his gaze landing on the trade-in desk near the showroom entrance. An older woman, her hair streaked with gray, clutched the hand of an equally aged man standing beside her. Their clothes were neat but worn, their expressions filled with quiet desperation. Opposite them stood Victor Steele, the general manager of Falcon Auto Houston. Luke recognized him instantly. He had personally hired Victor years ago, impressed by his drive and charisma. But the man standing at the trade-in desk now was not the person Luke had once trusted. Victor's arms were crossed, his face an unreadable mask. "Ma'am, I understand this is difficult, but my hands are tied." The elderly woman wiped at her eyes. "This car belonged to our son. He passed away last year. We kept it as long as we could, but we just can't afford the repairs anymore." Luke's stomach tightened. The old man, his knuckles white as he clutched his wife's hand, nodded. "We just need something safe, something reliable. But we were hoping," he hesitated, "hoping we could get a fair deal." Victor sighed, exasperated. "Sir, this car's nearly 15 years old with over 200,000 miles on it. The best I can do is $1,500. Luke felt his blood pressure spike. Ha, $1,500? For a car that, even with its age, was worth at least twice that. The woman's lower lip quivered. "Please, that's too low. Can't you just—" Victor cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Look, I get it. You have an emotional attachment to the car, but sentiment doesn't add value. This is the best offer you're going to get." Luke couldn't stay silent any longer. He stepped forward. "Excuse me, what's going on here?" Victor turned, annoyance flashing in his eyes. "Sir, this is a private discussion." Luke played dumb. "I was just looking at that car. I might be interested in buying it. What's the trade-in value?" Victor hesitated, then repeated, 1,500. Luke let out a low whistle. "That's it? For a car in that condition?" Victor's eyes darkened with suspicion. "It's an old model with high mileage." Luke crossed his arms. "I'll give them $4,000 for it." A stunned silence followed. The elderly couple gasped. Victor's jaw tightened. "That's not how this works." His voice was low, irritated. Luke met his stare, unflinching. "It is today?" Victor's face darkened, but before he could protest, Luke turned to the couple and said, "Let's talk outside." He led them toward the parking lot, his mind already racing. This wasn't just one bad deal. This was systemic, and he was about to bring the whole system down. The sun was beginning to set as Luke Calloway stood outside Falcon Auto Houston, hands in his pockets, listening as Eleanor and Frank Parker told him their story. Eleanor gripped her husband's hand tightly as she spoke, her voice wavering but strong. "Our son Matt was a firefighter," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "This car, it was his first big purchase after he got his job. He loved it, took care of it like it was a part of the family." Frank, his lined face weathered by years of hard work, nodded solemnly. "We couldn't bring ourselves to sell it after he passed away. We thought maybe one day we'd fix it up, keep it running in his memory." Luke felt something twist in his chest. He knew loss. He knew the pain of having something ripped away from you, something irreplaceable. Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. "But we can't afford the repairs anymore, and we can't keep paying the insurance. We just need something reliable." Luke exhaled slowly, clenching his jaw to keep his emotions in check. This wasn't just about a trade-in. It was about people being preyed on in their most vulnerable moments. He glanced back at the dealership, where Victor Steele still stood inside, watching through the glass with an expression of cold irritation. Luke turned back to the couple and pulled out his checkbook. "So here's what we're going to do," he said, keeping his voice steady. I'm going to buy this car from you, but not for $1,500. I'm giving you $5,000. Eleanor gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Oh no, we couldn't possibly. Frank shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. That's too much, son. We don't want charity. Luke met his gaze, his tone firm but kind. It's not charity. It's the right price. He gestured toward the dealership. That man in there was about to steal from you, and I won't let that happen. Frank hesitated, but Eleanor's grip on his hand tightened. Frank, she whispered. It's Matt's car. He'd want it to go to someone who cares. Slowly, Frank nodded. His hand trembled as he reached out to shake Luke's. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Luke handed them the check and took the keys. As Eleanor wiped away silent tears, Luke made a promise to himself. This was just the beginning. The real fight was about to start. Luke stepped back inside Falcon Auto Houston, the weight of Victor's cold glare pressing against him. The air inside the dealership was thick with stale coffee and tension, employees casting uneasy glances toward him. Victor strode forward, his expression carefully controlled, but his voice laced with irritation. What exactly do you think you're doing? Luke didn't hesitate. Buying a car. That's still allowed here, isn't it? Victor's jaw tensed. You just cost this dealership a sale. Luke arched a brow, feigning curiosity. Or did I just stop you from robbing those people? Victor's smile was tight and insincere. That's how business works. You offer the lowest trade-in price possible. If they take it, they take it. It's not our fault they didn't negotiate better. Luke felt a slow boiling rage creep into his veins. This isn't business, he said, his voice dangerously low. It's manipulation. You prey on people who are desperate, who don't know the game, and you call it a deal. Victor's eyes flickered, a brief flash of uncertainty before he regained his smug composure. You know, you sound awfully passionate for someone who just walked in off the street. Luke held his gaze. The time for pretending was over. You're right, he said coolly. I'm not just some customer. Victor's smirk vanished. Luke reached into his jacket and pulled out his business card, holding it up between two fingers. The golden Falcon Auto Group logo glinted under the fluorescent lights. My name is Lucas Calloway, he said, his voice ringing through the silent showroom. Preza, I own this company. Employees froze. A few sucked in sharp breaths. Some looked away, avoiding his gaze altogether. Others, especially the newer hires, looked genuinely stunned. Victor? He went pale. For the first time since their conversation began, he didn't have a comeback. Luke took a slow step forward, his tone calm but unyielding. And I just watched you lie to those customers. I watched you try to cheat them out of their car's true value. His eyes flicked around the room, making sure every employee could hear. And now I have to ask myself, how many times have you done this before? Victor's expression flickered with something unreadable. Panic, maybe, or realization. Then, just as quickly, his mask of arrogance slipped back into place. I didn't know who you were, he said, his voice defensive. Luke's stare was like steel. So if I wasn't the owner, you wouldn't have thought twice about screwing over those people. Victor opened his mouth, then closed it. Luke let the silence stretch uncomfortably long. Then he turned to face the gathered employees. I need to know something, he said, his tone now directed at the entire dealership. How many of you have seen customers leave here feeling like they were cheated? A few employees shifted. Some looked at their shoes, others cast nervous glances at Victor. Then, from near the back of the showroom, a young salesman, Kyle according to his name tag, hesitantly raised his hand. Victor whipped around, his glare deadly. Kyle... But Luke cut him off. Let him speak. Kyle hesitated, but then, with a deep breath, he said, It happens a lot. Luke's stomach turned. Kyle cleared his throat and continued. We're told to push higher interest rates on people who don't ask questions, especially older customers, or single moms, people who are more likely to just sign without reading. He glanced nervously at Victor, but then squared his shoulders. Rick, that's our finance guy. He's even bragged about how much extra money he's squeezed out of people who didn't even know they were getting screwed. Luke felt something in him snap. His voice, when it came, was calm, but like ice. That ends today. Victor's face darkened. Excuse me? Luke turned to him. You're fired, Victor. A collective gasp rippled through the showroom. Victor stiffened, his hands balling into fists. You're making a mistake. Luke didn't flinch. No, I'm correcting one. Victor's mouth twisted into a sneer. You think you're some kind of hero, Calloway? Fine, but you have no idea what you've just started. With that, he grabbed his coat and stormed toward the exit. The second the door slammed shut behind him, the room let out a breath it didn't realize it was holding. Luke turned back to the staff. Starting now, he said, his voice steady but powerful, Falcon Auto Houston does business differently. If you're not on board with that, walk out now. And just like that, a war had begun. The silence in the dealership hung heavy, like a thick fog settling over a battlefield after the first cannon shot. Victor Steele was gone, but the war was far from over. Luke! Calloway stood in the center of the showroom, his pulse still pounding in his ears. He had done it. He had fired Victor, the man responsible for turning Falcon Auto Houston into a den of deception. But as he looked around at the employees who remained, some with relieved expressions, others tense with uncertainty, he knew that his battle was only just beginning. Kyle, the young salesman who had spoken up, shifted nervously. Sir, what happens now? Luke exhaled slowly, his mind racing. What happens now? That was the question, wasn't it? He had walked in here thinking he was simply rooting out a bad manager, but what he had uncovered was so much worse. This wasn't just about one dishonest general manager. This was systemic. And the rot? It went deeper than he'd realized. Luke took a step forward, running a hand through his hair. Now, he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him, we start fixing this mess. The first thing Luke did was call a staff meeting. He wanted every employee in one room. Not just salespeople, but finance officers, customer service reps, technicians, even janitorial staff. By the time everyone had squeezed into the employee lounge, the air was thick with tension. Employees whispered among themselves, some stealing uneasy glances at Luke. He surveyed the room, reading the faces, the body language. Some employees looked ashamed, others defensive, and a few were still in shock from Victor's firing. Let me start with this, Luke began, his voice carrying across the room. If you're here to defend the way this place was run, you can leave right now. Silence. No one moved. Good, he said. Then let's talk about how we fix this. He turned to Kyle, who had been brave enough to speak up first. You said customers were being pressured into high-interest loans, right? Kyle nodded, but his expression was hesitant. Yeah, and the warranties too. Half the time people don't even know they're paying for them. Luke's jaw tightened. He looked toward Darren, one of the finance officers, who was visibly sweating in the back corner. Luke motioned for him to step forward. Darren hesitated. Sir, I just did what I was told. Luke studied him, his expression unreadable. And what exactly were you told? Darian's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. Victor, he had a system. If someone seemed like they wouldn't read the fine print, we added extras. Warranty markups, higher interest rates, unnecessary fees. It was subtle, enough that most people didn't question it. Luke felt a slow, controlled fury build in his chest. They had been scamming people for years. How many customers got screwed over? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Darren's eyes darted around the room. I don't know. A lot. Luke took a deep breath, letting that sink in. Then he turned to the rest of the staff. From this moment on, that stops. Anyone caught inflating prices, pushing unnecessary add-ons, or misleading customers will be fired on the spot. A few employees shuffled uncomfortably, while others nodded with quiet relief. Then Luke added, and we're going to start making things right." For the next 3 hours, Luke and his team combed through past sales records, searching for every shady deal, every inflated contract, every overcharged customer. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of people had been cheated. Thousands of dollars had been stolen under the guise of business as usual. Luke's stomach churned as he flipped through the files, seeing name after name of customers who had unknowingly been victims of a dealership they thought they could trust. A name stood out: Evelyn Torres. She was the single mother he had overheard on his first day undercover, the woman who had been pressured into a terrible deal. Luke glanced at the sales contract, a $7,000 down payment on a car that wasn't even worth $5,000. And the interest rate? Borderline predatory. His hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just unethical, it was theft. He picked up the phone and dialed her number. Evelyn answered on the third ring, her voice wary. "Hello?" "Ms. Torres," Luke said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "This is Lucas Calloway. I own Falcon Auto Group." A pause. Then, a bitter laugh. "Oh, really? And what do I owe the honor?" Luke exhaled. "I'm calling about your car purchase." She let out a sharp breath. "Let me guess. You want to offer me a new deal? Or maybe you're calling to tell me that somehow, some way, you're increasing my payments?" Taylor replied with a little smile. There was so much exhaustion in her voice, so much frustration. Luke felt a pang of guilt. "No," he said, his tone softer now. "I'm calling to tell you that you were cheated, and I'm going to fix it." Silence. For a moment, he thought she had hung up. Then, her voice, small and uncertain. "What?" Luke looked at her file. "The contract you signed was predatory. You were overcharged, and the loan terms were designed to keep you paying more than you should have. That isn't how we do business. At least not anymore." "Then you're serious?" Luke nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I've already processed a refund for the extra fees, and I want to offer you a chance to restructure your financing at a fair rate." A sharp intake of breath. "Wait?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Why would you do this?" Luke closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "Because it's the right thing to do." And then he heard it. A quiet sob on the other end of the line. She was crying. "Miss Torres," he said, his voice gentle. "Are you okay?" She sniffled, letting out a shaky laugh. I've never had someone actually do something like this for me. I've been fighting for so long, no one ever cared." Luke swallowed past the lump in his throat. "I care," he said simply. Evelyn's story spread like wildfire. Within days, customers began calling, emailing, even walking into the dealership asking if Falcon Auto was really fixing bad deals. And one by one, Luke made it happen. He refunded overcharged customers. He cut out hidden fees. He slashed interest rates that had been unfairly inflated. For every scam uncovered, Luke made sure it was made right. But not everyone was happy. Some of the higher-ups in Falcon Auto Group's corporate offices were furious. "You're bleeding money," his CFO Richard Webb snapped during a tense meeting. "If you keep this up, you're going to sink this company." Luke didn't flinch. "If we have to cheat people to stay in business, then we deserve to sink." Webb leaned forward, his expression dark. "You're making enemies, Luke." Luke met his gaze, unwavering. Good. Because he wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Luke. Calloway had expected resistance. He had expected pushback from the corporate office, grumbling from old-school salesmen, and even a temporary drop in profits. What he hadn't expected was all-out war. It started subtly. A few whispers in industry circles, a couple of scathing news articles labeling him as a reckless idealist, ruining his own empire. Then it escalated. One morning, Chris, one of the younger salesmen who had stepped up during the dealership's transition, rushed into Luke's office, his face pale. "Boss," he panted, waving his phone in the air. "You need to see this." Luke grabbed the phone and scanned the headline. His stomach tightened. Falconato's refund stunt exposed as a cover-up for years of deception. The headlines made it sound brilliant plan. His jaw clenched as he skimmed the article. It was filled with half-truths and outright lies, twisting his reforms into a desperate attempt to save face. The article claimed that Luke had been covering up past frauds, only fixing problems now because he'd been caught. And then came the worst part. A former Falcon Auto executive reveals that Calloway knowingly ignored unethical practices for years and only stepped in after public pressure. Luke's blood turned to ice. He leaned back in his chair, gripping the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. He knew who was behind this. There was only one man who could orchestrate an attack like this. Alexander Kane. Alexander Kane was a legend in the car dealership world. He was ruthless, cunning, and built his empire, Titan Motors, on aggressive sales tactics, razor-thin discounts, and high sale volume sales. Kane and Luke had never seen eye to eye. Where Luke had tried to build trust with customers, Kane had openly boasted about milking the suckers for every penny. And now, Kane had found his opening. Luke was dangerous to him, not just as a business rival, but as an ideological threat. If Falcon Auto's new model of honest business succeeded, customers would demand the same from every dealership, including Titan Motors. And Kane would never allow that to happen. A day after the article went viral, customers started canceling their orders. Luke stood in the showroom, watching as a couple who had just finalized a deal the day before came storming back in. The husband, a burly man in his 50s, slammed a printed version of the article onto the front desk. "I thought you guys were supposed to be different," he growled. "Turns out, you were just cleaning up your own mess." His wife crossed her arms, glaring at the employees. "I don't want our money supporting crooks. Cancel the sale." Luke stepped forward, his stomach sinking. "Sir, if you'll give me a chance to explain." "I don't want an explanation," the man cut him off, shaking his head. "I want a refund." Luke had no choice. He gave them their money back. And just like that, 2 more customers walked out the door. The next day, it got worse. A dozen more customers canceled their purchases, saying they didn't want to take the risk. By the end of the week, Falcon Auto Houston's sales had dropped by nearly 40%. Luke had anticipated a loss, but not like this. This was sabotage. And Kane wasn't done yet. Luke had been in this business long enough to know that when profits dropped, corporate sharks started circling. His instincts were dead on. 2 weeks after Kane's article went viral, Luke was summoned to a board meeting. He walked into the sleek, glass-paneled conference room in Falcon Auto's headquarters, his shoulders squared and his jaw set. The board members stared at him, their faces grim. Richard Webb, the CFO, who had always favored profits over ethics, leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Luke," he said smoothly, "we need to talk about your recent decisions." Luke kept his expression neutral, but inside, his anger simmered. "Go ahead," he said. "Talk." Richard sighed, pretending to be sympathetic. "The numbers aren't looking good, Luke. Customers are leaving. Our stock is dipping. We're bleeding money." Luke crossed his arms. "So, we expected a dip. Long-term trust is worth more than short-term losses." Richard gave him a pitying look. "Luke, we understand that you're passionate about this." "Passionate?" Luke let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "I'm not passionate, Richard. I'm right." A few board members exchanged uneasy glances. Richard sighed dramatically, as if Luke was a child who didn't understand how the real world worked. "We've had discussions," he said carefully, "and we think it's best if you step down as CEO." Luke's heart stopped. For a moment the words didn't register. Then, slowly, his fingernails dug into his palms. "Excuse me?" Richard spread his hands. "Look, it's nothing personal. We just think the company would be better off under someone more pragmatic or willing to play dirty." Luke's muscles tensed, but he kept his voice dangerously even. "Who put you up to this?" Richard's smug expression told him everything. "Kane." Alexander Kane had gotten to them. Luke's pulse pounded in his ears. "You're making a mistake." Richard shrugged. "No, Luke, you did." By the end of the day, Luke was out. Just like that, his own company, the business he built with his own two hands, was ripped away from him. They offered him a graceful exit, a chance to step down quietly. He refused. The next morning, the news hit the press. Lucas Calloway ousted as CEO of Falcon Auto Group amid sales collapse. The headlines twisted the story, making it seem like he had been removed for incompetence. Kane's plan had worked. Luke watched from the sidelines as a new CEO was appointed. A spineless corporate puppet who immediately reversed all of Luke's reforms. Within days, Falcon Auto was back to its old tricks. The refunds stopped. The predatory sales tactics returned. And Luke, he was nothing. For the first time in years, he had no company, no power, no way to fight back. Kane had destroyed him. Or so he thought. Luke spent the next 2 weeks in his small Houston apartment, watching as everything he had built was dismantled piece by piece. For the first time in a long time, he felt helpless. Then, one night, as he sat in the dark, staring at a bottle of whiskey he hadn't opened yet, his phone buzzed. He almost ignored it, but something made him look down at the screen. It was a text. From Evelyn Torres. "You saved me when no one else would. Now it's my turn to return the favor. Are you ready to fight back?" Luke's breath caught in his throat, and in that moment something stirred inside him. A fire. A purpose. He wasn't done yet. He was just getting started. Luke. Calloway stared at his phone. The words on the screen glowed in the darkness of his apartment, cutting through the haze of exhaustion and frustration that had settled over him like a suffocating blanket. "You saved me when no one else would. Now it's my turn to return the favor. Are you ready to fight back?" The message from Evelyn Torres felt like a lifeline, one he hadn't realized he needed until that very moment. For weeks, he had been drowning in the aftermath of his downfall. His company had been ripped away, his reputation dragged through the mud, and everything he had spent years building had crumbled overnight. He had gone from a respected CEO to a man without a purpose. And yet, as he read Evelyn's words, a fire rekindled inside him. Maybe he had lost Falcon Auto, but he hadn't lost his fight. Taking a deep breath, Luke texted back, "Tell me everything." The next morning, Luke met Evelyn at a small diner on the outskirts of Houston. It was a quiet place, the kind where the coffee was strong and the waitresses knew their customers by name. Evelyn was already there, sitting in a corner booth. Her face was serious, determined, but there was an edge of hope in her eyes. Luke slid into the seat across from her, folding his hands on the table. "All right," he said, "talk to me." Evelyn took a breath. "After you fixed my deal, I started telling people what you did. I didn't expect much, but then something happened." She pulled out her phone and showed him a Facebook group. The title at the top read, "Falcon Auto's Victims. The Truth." Luke's brow furrowed as he scrolled through the posts. Hundreds of customers had joined. People were sharing their stories of being scammed, of hidden fees, of contracts they didn't understand until it was too late. "I started the group 2 weeks ago," Evelyn said. "It's growing every day." Luke's stomach tightened. How many of these people were impacted before I stepped in? Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "Some, but most of these stories, they happened after you were forced out." Luke gritted his teeth. He had hoped that Falcon Auto might have kept some of his reforms, but he should have known better. Richard Webb, the board, Kane, none of them cared about doing the right thing. They had doubled down on their tactics, squeezing every dollar they could out of their customers, fearing no consequences. Until now. Luke looked back at Evelyn. "What do you want to do?" Evelyn held his gaze, unwaveringly exposed them, publicly. "We're not just talking about a few bad sales anymore, Luke. This is fraud, on a massive scale." Luke's mind raced. He had spent years in the industry. He knew that dealerships like Titan Motors and Falcon Auto operated in a gray area, always staying just inside the lines of legality. But if Evelyn was right, if they had crossed the line, then this wasn't just an ethical battle. This could be a legal one. And if they could prove it, they could take everything from Kane. Luke exhaled, his decision made. Let's burn them to the ground. Luke didn't waste time. With Evelyn leading the charge, they reached out to customers, gathering evidence, contracts, receipts, recorded phone calls, anything that could prove what was happening. The more they dug, the worse it got. One woman had been sold a warranty she never agreed to, only to find out later it had doubled her monthly payment. An elderly veteran had traded in his truck, believing he was getting a fair deal, only for Titan Motors to turn around and resell it for triple the price. A single father had been promised a 2% interest rate on his financing, but when he checked his paperwork, it was actually 9%. And the most damning piece of evidence? A whistleblower. Kyle, the young salesman from Falcon Auto Houston, reached out to Luke. I quit last week, he admitted, when they met at a gas station outside the city. I couldn't do it anymore. Then, he handed Luke a USB drive. Luke stared at it. What's on this? Kyle looked him in the eye. Everything. Sales scripts, internal memos, training manuals, all detailing exactly how the dealerships were scamming customers. Luke clenched the drive in his fist. This was it. The smoking gun. Luke called in every favor he had left. He contacted journalists, consumer rights groups, even a lawyer who had once been his fiercest critic. Within 48 hours, the first news segment aired. Titan Motors and Falcon Auto exposed in massive consumer fraud investigation. The story went viral overnight. Customers came forward by the hundreds. State investigators opened a formal inquiry. And Kane was cornered. 3 days after the story broke, Luke got an unexpected call. Alexander Kane. Luke let it ring, debating whether to answer. Then he smirked and hit accept. Calloway. Kane's voice was tighter than usual, his usual arrogance dampened. You made your point. Congratulations. Luke leaned back against his chair. Oh, I don't think I've made my point yet. Kane's voice hardened. You think this is over? You think you've won? Luke chuckled. I think you're scared. A pause. Then, Kane let out a humorless laugh. Everyone plays dirty in this business, Calloway, including you. Luke's grip tightened on his phone. Maybe I made some mistakes in the past, but here's the difference. I'm not hiding from them. Kane's tone turned cold. You don't know what you've started. Luke's voice was like steel. I know exactly what I started, and with that, he hung up. Within a week, Titan Motors collapsed. Kane's empire crumbled as customers sued, dealerships pulled their contracts, and investors abandoned him. Falcon Auto's board of directors panicked. They called Luke, begged him to return. His response? No. He didn't want Falcon Auto anymore. He wanted something better. 6 months later, Luke stood in front of the glass doors of his new dealership, a place built from the ground up, with customer trust at its core. Evelyn stood beside him, now working as the head of customer advocacy. Kyle was there, too, now his sales manager. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about doing it the right way. Luke exhaled, taking it all in. Then he pushed open the doors and walked into the future. The glass doors of Calloway Automotive reflected the morning sun, casting a golden glow across the freshly paved lot. It was officially opening day, and yet, to Luke, Calloway, it felt like something much bigger than that. It wasn't just the beginning of a new business, it was the beginning of a movement. Luke stood at the entrance, hands in his pockets, taking in the sight before him. Rows of cars that weren't just products to sell, but symbols of trust. His team, hand-picked, honest, and ready to serve with integrity, bustled about making final preparations. Kyle checked inventory, ensuring everything was set for the first customers. Evelyn, now the head of customer advocacy, went over financing documents, making sure there was no fine print designed to trick buyers. There were no hidden fees, no predatory tactics, no shady managers looming over scared customers, just real people doing honest work. Luke exhaled slowly, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. This was what winning looked like. The first car to leave the lot that morning wasn't a luxury sedan or a high-end sports car. It was a modest, reliable Toyota Camry. The buyer? A single mother with 2 kids, Samantha Wright. As she held her new keys in her hands, she looked at Luke with tears welling in her eyes. "You don't know what this means to me," she whispered. "Every other dealership, they treated me like I was nothing. They tried to scam me, push me into payments I couldn't afford." She swallowed hard. "I almost gave up, but then I heard about this place, about you." Luke felt his chest tighten. This was why he had fought so hard, for people like her. He extended his hand, and when she shook it, he gave her the same promise he gave to every customer who walked through those doors. "We'll always do right by you." Samantha nodded, a small but genuine smile breaking through her exhaustion. "I believe you." And just like that, Calloway Automotive had its first official customer. Luke was just about to step into his office when his phone buzzed, an unknown number. He hesitated. After everything that had happened, he wasn't particularly eager to take calls from people he didn't know, but something in his gut told him to answer. He swiped the screen. "Hello?" A pause. Then, a voice he never thought he'd hear again. "Hello, Luke?" His breath hitched. Richard Webb. The former Falconov CFO, the man who had led the charge to have him removed, who had backed Kane's takeover. Luke's grip tightened on the phone. "Why are you calling me?" Richard let out a long sigh. I made a mistake." Luke let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "That's putting it lightly." "I shouldn't have sided with Kane," Richard admitted. "I thought we could control him. I thought we could keep the company afloat. But after you left..." He trailed off. Luke already knew the answer. After he left, Falcon Auto fell apart. Sales plummeted. Lawsuits stacked up. The board panicked, but Kane jumped ship. He sold his remaining shares and vanished, leaving the company in ruins. And now Richard Webb, the man who betrayed Luke, was calling for help. Luke's jaw clenched. "Let me guess, you want me to come back and fix your mess?" Richard hesitated, then, softly, Luke closed his eyes, exhaling deeply. For years, Falcon Auto had been his life, his creation, his legacy. But that wasn't true anymore. He had built something better, something that wasn't built on corporate greed, boardroom politics, or the constant pressure to sacrifice integrity for profit. This was his new legacy, and he had no intention of going back. So Luke did what he never thought he'd do. He said no. "I don't belong there anymore," he said, his voice steady, unshaken. Richard sighed again, heavier this time. "I figured you'd say that." Then, after a pause, he added, "For what it's worth, I respect what you're doing." Luke didn't respond. He just ended the call. Then he turned, walked into his own office, and shut the door. Later that evening, after the last customer had driven off, Kyle poked his head into Luke's office. "Hey boss," he said, "there's something here for you." Luke looked up as Kyle handed him an envelope. It was slightly worn, the handwriting neat but aged. Luke frowned. "Who's it from?" Kyle shrugged. "Some elderly couple stopped by earlier, said they wanted to give it to you personally, but they had to leave." Luke's stomach turned. He knew exactly who it was from. Slowly, he opened the envelope and pulled out the letter. "Dear Mr. Calloway, we don't know if you remember us, but we will never forget you. You saved us when we were at our lowest. You bought our son's car not just because it was a vehicle, but because you understood what it meant to us. You didn't just change our lives that day. You restored our faith in people." We thought you might like to know. His car has been restored just like we dreamed. It's running beautifully now, thanks to a mechanic who heard our story and refused to charge us for the work. It felt like Matt was with us again. We know he would have liked you, Mr. Calloway. In fact, we think he would have wanted you to have something. Luke swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. He reached into the envelope again and pulled out a small, worn key. There was a note attached to it. Matt's car belongs with someone who understands its value. It belongs with you. Luke felt his breath hitch. His vision blurred as emotion rose in his throat. Eleanor and Frank had given him their son's car. Not because they had to, not because he asked, but because they believed in him. Because he had done something worth believing in. He clenched the key in his palm, shutting his eyes for a moment. Then, he took a deep breath and smiled. Later that night, after everyone had left, Luke stood in the empty lot of Calloway Automotive, staring at the key in his hand. He walked toward the garage, where a single car was parked, the same car that once belonged to a firefighter who gave his life for others. Luke ran his fingers over the hood, feeling the smooth, cool metal beneath his touch. This wasn't just a car. It was a legacy, just like what he had built. Just like what he was still building. And with one last deep breath, he climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key and listened as the engine roared to life. And as he pulled onto the open road, with the city lights glowing in the distance, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Ladies and gentlemen, what does it truly mean to fight for what's right? Throughout this journey, we've watched Luke Calloway stand up against corruption, risk everything to bring justice to those who had been wronged, and refuse to back down in the face of overwhelming adversity. This is more than just a story about a business. This is a story about honor, integrity, and resilience. Luke didn't just lose a company. He lost his legacy, his reputation, and nearly his own faith in the fight for honesty. But what made him remarkable was his refusal to let the system define him. Instead of staying down, he built something new from the ashes. Instead of choosing greed, he chose people. Instead of running away from the fight, he walked straight into the fire. Now here's the question for you. Would you have done the same? Would you have risked your career, your stability, your very name to do what's right? Would you have stood up against the corruption even when everyone told you to sit down? Luke Calloway isn't just a character. He represents the battle that so many people face in real life. The battle between profit and people. The battle between what's easy and what's right. The battle between giving up and standing your ground. And now, as Luke looks ahead to the future, we must ask ourselves, what's next? What should Luke do next? Luke has built a business founded on honesty, but the fight isn't over. His enemies, people like Alexander Kane and the corrupt corporate elites, will never stop looking for ways to tear him down. He's won a battle, but the war for ethical business isn't over. So what's his next move? Should he expand Calloway Automotive, proving to the world that ethical business can be profitable? Should he go after the bigger sharks, exposing the entire industry's corruption at a national level? Should he mentor the next generation of business owners, ensuring that his legacy lasts beyond his own lifetime? The choice is his, but maybe, just maybe, it's also yours. What do you think? If you believe in Luke's fight, comment yes below. Let's stand with him. Let's prove that integrity still matters. Because in the end, the good guys don't always finish last.